There are too many zombie movies. I think it's a phrase we've all heard before. Perhaps it's an opinion you share, and it's at least partly true. Since White Zombie in 1932, there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of zombie movies, although it's difficult to define what exactly is a zombie movie. But it's an opinion I never really agreed with. After all, you don't hear many people arguing that there are too many superhero movies, and despite many people's complaints against the endless stream of franchise revivals, it seems we can't go a month without at least one major sequel or reboot. It's also an opinion that doesn't appear to have spread beyond film circles. I can't even count the total number of zombie games released in 2024 so far. The zombie is a resilient creature. Since the release of Night of the Living Dead in 1968, the definition of a zombie and a zombie movie has more or less remained consistent. And while it's true that many zombie stories don't exactly try to break the mold by pushing zombies into new narrative territory, for as many shameless rip-offs and sequels, there also exist hidden gems that demonstrate zombies' remarkable fluidity through genres and metaphors. So in this series, I'll attempt to refute zombie fatigue, and analyze movies, TV shows, video games, and novels that demonstrate how zombies have stayed relevant by symbolizing contemporary social fears. To start off, we'll begin with a zombie story that isn't really a zombie story. In a world of dragons and ice zombies, it's easy to forget that Game of Thrones mirrors our own world in a myriad of ways. And no, it's not just the medieval realism, political intrigue, and moral ambiguity that recalls our own sordid history. It's actually the dragons and ice zombies, or at least the societal reactions to these tremendously powerful forces that shape the world of the series. George R.R. Martin has stated that the White Walkers, or the Others in his books, are a metaphor for climate change. The White Walkers hang over Westeros like a coming storm, an apocalyptic threat that makes the wars and political backstabbing among the show's characters seem pointlessly irrelevant. The climate metaphor is carried in everything from the creature's design to subplots that have very little to do with the White Walkers themselves. One way is through the elemental magic aspect of the creatures. The Walkers are the embodiment of winter, a force that literally brings the storm of an oncoming blizzard that threatens to freeze the world into an endless ice age. Their undead nature clearly recalls the Dragir of Norse mythology, but their desiccated and emaciated bodies also reference death by freezing and starvation, two of winter's deadliest threats. It's even implied that the Walkers are the cause behind the world's cycle of years-long winters. Although once human and still intelligent, the White Walkers are a homogeneous force, largely without complex motivations, at least ones that humans can't comprehend. Yes, the Walkers' origins are revealed in Season 6, and Bran gives a vague reason to the Night King's motivation in Season 8, but by the show's end, viewers were left with more questions than answers. Rather than ascribe history and human emotions to them, it's perhaps more appropriate to understand the Walkers as an elemental force, as if bringing winter and death to all life on Earth is a natural function rather than a goal born of emotion or ideology. Likewise, climate in our world is a purely natural force, indifferent to the existence of life that depends on it for survival. Yet it is extremely volatile. 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct, and it's likely that climate change played a role in the extinctions of the majority of Earth's species. But despite their mysticism and ties to nature, the White Walkers are very much a man-made crisis, or something close to man at least. You'll recall that more than 10,000 years before the show's events, the children of the forest created a magical weapon to fight the first men in a war for survival. Their weapon spiraled out of control, targeting children and men alike in a war that threatened the survival of humanity and our closest relatives. This chilling origin reminds viewers of a fundamental anxiety related to the ongoing climate crisis. Climate change has always existed, but our responsibility for the ongoing crisis is undeniable. The children of the forest remain a cautionary tale. They may have survived their first war against the White Walkers, but they exist in a diminished state, living in extreme seclusion and forever ceding their former territory to humanity, their original enemies. The physical distinction and age difference between the children of the forest and humanity represent the generational gap between the creators of the climate crisis and those who will be forced to deal with the worst cascade effects. Our grandparents may have laid the foundation for this crisis, but it'll be up to us and our children to solve it, or at the very least, to survive it. The White Walkers' acts of destruction mirror the most recognizable images of the climate crisis in our world. The White Walker invasion begins in earnest when they destroy the Wall, the most symbolic and formidable barrier against just such a scenario. Not only does the Wall's collapse evoke those breathtaking videos of glaciers calving, but the event itself marks a monumental tipping point in the White Walker crisis that has been escalating through the show's 7 seasons. For years, the army of the dead has been steadily growing in numbers, and the walkers are revealed to have magical powers. Disasters like the Hardhome Massacre and the Battle on the Frozen Lake demonstrate the walkers' power, and give Jon Snow and company a taste of what an all-out invasion of the world will entail. Extreme weather events like wildfires and severe floods may be our versions of the Hardhome Massacre, widely publicized spectacles that demonstrate the destructive power of climate change. These disasters indicate the looming catastrophe that many will disbelieve, but none can deny the visceral reaction they provoke when viewed on our phone screens. But as terrifying as the Hardhome Massacre was to the Free Folk in the Night's Watch in Season 5, the Walkers don't blitz into the south until Season 8. This parallels the steady rise in sea levels and desertification in our climate-ravaged future, threatening to turn densely populated regions of our world uninhabitable. Finally, when the White Walkers destroy the Wall in Season 7, the Seven Kingdoms and viewers alike understand that a catastrophic tipping point has been reached. From here on out, a Walker invasion is not only inevitable, it's right at their doorstep. As the Season 7 tagline states, "Winter is here." The White Walkers are the clearest climate change metaphor in Game of Thrones, but just like climate in our world, they don't exist in a vacuum. The show revolves around dozens of storylines, following 52 characters, most of whom live and die with no knowledge of the White Walkers, yet they are the existential threat hanging over the show from the very first scene. It's not until Season 4 that cascade effects of the crisis become impossible to ignore. A mass migration of wildlings flee south, essentially becoming climate refugees as they flee the marching army of the dead. But even in the medieval world of Game of Thrones, no land is just waiting for the taking. Jon Snow spends the majority of his tenure in the Night's Watch attempting to convince his brotherhood to put aside their historical enmity and arrange a mass evacuation of wildlings past the Wall, the barrier that has separated the two peoples for millennia. Just as the Night's Watch must deal with a sudden influx of people pressed against their nation's border, the developed nations of our world are expected to deal with an unprecedented flow of refugees due to climate change in the coming decades, due to worsening environmental, economic, and political conditions. Unfortunately for Westeros and our world, immigration is a contentious issue colored by prejudice and desperation. Extremists like Master-at-Arms Alliser Thorne attempt to derail the peace process, motivated by deeply ingrained hatred against an enemy with whom his people have shed blood for millennia. Men of the older generation like Thorne prove harder to convince of what must be done about the White Walker threat than the younger, more open-minded, dare I say progressive men like Jon Snow. In the 8,000 years since the White Walker's first defeat, the Wall has lost its original purpose and come to symbolize the cultural divide between the nomadic, survivalist free folk and the wealthy, sedentary kingdoms. As with Trump's attempted border wall, it's a barrier maintained not out of practicality but xenophobia. Neither barriers prove to be effective against the people they try to keep out. The free folk breach the wall in battles and constant raids, and the White Walkers destroy the wall within seconds upon encountering it for the first time. Similarly, the barriers along the US-Mexico border are largely ineffective against preventing illegal immigration. While the Night's Watch may be extremely reluctant to accept the wildling refugees, we never see outright denial of the White Walkers' existence. After Jon Snow evacuates the wildlings and purges the Night's Watch of traitorous extremists, he shifts his attention to convincing the Seven Kingdoms of the existence and threat posed by the Walkers. Walker skepticism is widespread in Westeros due to a combination of factors. One is that the low fantasy world of Game of Thrones is not like your traditional fantasy setting. Magic and monsters are outliers, rarely seen and poorly understood. It's harder to convince someone of a threat when that threat doesn't have a material appearance easily seen and remembered by people. In our world, it's not easy to convince skeptics that the climate crisis is real when natural disasters happen all the time, and sea level rise is gradual. Lannisters and Targaryens are difficult to convince when years-long winters only come once a decade at most, and ice zombies haven't been spotted in 8,000 years, more than long enough for them to pass into myth. A second cause of Walker's skepticism is that the richer southern kingdoms of Westeros are conveniently insulated from White Walker attacks by wealth and geography, and thus remain willfully ignorant of the growing threat from the north. The White Walkers are a source of existential dread for the free folk, Westeros' northernmost culture. If one region of Earth could be most associated with climate change, it would be the Arctic. This is more than because pictures of polar bears stuck on icebergs make us sad. The Arctic is warming 2.5 times faster than the global average, melting sea ice and increasing sea levels around the world. Where the free folk understand the reality that if the White Walkers were to return, they'd be the first to go, southern nations like the Seven Kingdoms live life worrying about little more than their status and wealth. This dynamic mirrors the climate denial and lack of preparedness of many first world nations in our world, contrasted to poorer and less geographically fortunate countries that will be affected the worst by the climate crisis. To be fair, nations everywhere are engaged in issues of extreme importance beyond the climate crisis. We're not all plotting and stabbing each other just for wealth and power. But humans, as self-centered as we are, must work against our instincts to tackle a problem of extreme complexity and magnitude. A third reason for Walker's skepticism is quite simply that the kings and queens of the Seven Kingdoms have more immediate threats to worry about than the end of the world. The monarchs of Westeros are conditioned to be conscious of their status and vigilant for threats from other monarchs, with very good reason. But as elemental and all-powerful as the White Walkers appear to be, they can be defeated. In Season 7, protagonists Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen travel south to convince their arch-enemy Queen Cersei to implement a truce and join forces to fight the coming invasion. From Independence Day to Pacific Rim, adversaries putting aside conflict and forming unity against a global threat is a common and somewhat cliched trope in apocalyptic disaster fiction. International treaties like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement represent consensus in the battle against climate change, but human nature is fickle. We're not likely to see global or even domestic adversaries forgiving all conflicts and teaming up against an apocalyptic threat, whether that be aliens, zombies, or climate change. Even after apparently agreeing to a formal truce and pledging to send her army north alongside Daenerys, the Lannister army is curiously absent when the White Walkers arrive at Winterfell. Cersei's strategy is to let the two forces kill each other off and fight whoever's left. This may be a tragic reality in our world when powerful forces are willing to lie to further their goals of maintaining power and wealth. Cersei's strategy is all too familiar to climate change advocates fighting the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry has proven it is unwilling to fight climate change, ultimately because corporations prioritize maintaining their wealth and power over the sacrifice needed to avert disaster for the planet and civilization. But Game of Thrones is not a perfect analog for climate change. Not only is Cersei willing to gamble on the extremely unlikely event of a Targaryen victory over the White Walkers in the north, but she doesn't understand how the Walkers operate. If the Walkers march on King's Landing, the army of the dead will have exponentially increased in size because of the Walkers' ability to reanimate the dead. In our world, fossil fuel executives may understand how the climate crisis will unfold, but their wealth and influence affords them the ability to survive the crisis relatively unscathed. But treaties and agreements are more than symbolic. Plausible solutions exist to mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis, as do weapons and strategies that can defeat the White Walkers. Just like nations can work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, humans can mass-produce obsidian weapons and use dragonfire to fight the White Walkers, where most other weapons fail. Walker leadership can be targeted and assassinated. The mainstream message about climate change isn't all doom and gloom. It's about action through strategies and sacrifices. As we so often hear from climate advocates,
we can do it. It's within our power to do it.
Because, just like the ever-growing and always marching army of the dead, climate change will eventually devastate everyone in our world if politics and human impulses are not put aside for the sake of survival. But okay, if Game of Thrones is a metaphor for climate change, then what does it all mean? I don't just mean what are all the comparisons we can make, but what lessons does the show arrive at by its conclusion? Well, it's unfortunate that the White Walker storyline ends in such a logic-defying anti-climax. No one individual is going to solve the climate crisis with a little bit of magic and a hell of a lot of luck. Perhaps a more realistic and thematically poignant ending would have been the White Walkers' victory over a divided Westeros, as depressing as that sounds. But maybe I'm missing the point. What if Game of Thrones' ultimate message about climate change can be summarized not from its climax, but from examining how the show's characters have dealt with the threat through its end? Jon Snow fought the Walkers not just through skilled swordsmanship, but through leadership, diplomacy, confronting outdated social conventions, and finding courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Daenerys and Tyrion eroded their skepticism through open-mindedness and being daring enough to see the threat for themselves. Cersei dealt with the Walkers through greed, lies, and ignorance. Now, these are pretty simplistic lessons we can apply to climate change. But maybe Game of Thrones' best lesson about climate change is viewers' understanding of how different Westeros' existential conflict is from ours. Westeros is very similar to our world. The White Walkers are similar to climate change. If we lived in the world of Game of Thrones, maybe humanity really would be driven to extinction by the White Walkers. But Westeros is not our world. We are no longer in the Middle Ages. We are not facing a malign intelligence bent on our extinction. Our level of scientific understanding, technological advancement, and political will vastly surpasses Westeros. Climate change is not out to kill us. It may be the most complex existential problem humanity has ever faced, but humans are natural problem solvers. Let's circle this back to zombies. Game of Thrones' contribution to the zombie genre has gone largely underappreciated, but I believe the show should be firmly embraced within zombie canon for its social commentary. We may love the visceral thrill of seeing zombie heads explode and indulging in post-apocalyptic fantasies of violence and survival, but we should admit that zombies are at their best when they thematically express humanity's societal anxieties. Through the lens of the zombie movie, perhaps Game of Thrones can be viewed as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when humans are faced with a complex, easily misunderstood existential threat. Now, we don't need Game of Thrones to convince ourselves of the threat posed by climate change, but zombie fiction has defined itself as a subgenre through which we can simulate our worst fears, which beats living through them for real. Through Game of Thrones, perhaps we should take the lesson that man-made existential threats are complex, terrifying, and carry guilt, but they are also beatable. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch more analyses of movies, TV shows, books, and video games, like the video and subscribe to Casey Rukin. See you next time.